you might be onto something.
Yeah, I'm familiar. I use it with my students too.
All right. Hopefully that's not going to talk at us. All right, great. Welcome, everybody. We are here gathered today. Marriage is what brings us together today. And we're going to talk about the sacrament of holy matrimony. So let's hop into it. Just as a reminder, last week we had like a mega class. God bless for those who were able to stay for the all 2 hours, because we did basically a class and a half. This week is should be, I hope, a regular class, but there is a lot of material. So let's get to it. All right, come, slideshow, work. There you go. Why did God institute marriage? Well, that's within God's purview and wisdom, of course, but we see that we could talk about it in terms of holy companionship, that God wanted to provide us a means of unity, that he also wanted us to be able to multiply and fill the earth, and so have the procreation of children, which required complementarity on our part, the two biological sexes. And lastly, the overcoming of sin through our fidelity to one another through the sacrament of holy matrimony. So when we talk about the purpose of marriage, it's important that we don't try to reduce it to any one thing, because some people argue if your only reason is for this, then, why can't we do that, and so forth. And the point is, again, we're, as Orthodox Christians, we're trying to maximally, not minimally, define things and trying to find the fullness of what God's revelation is to us. And so sharing all the elements of married life are an important approach to understanding it. The deacon has joined me. So speaking of complementarity, we, of course, read in the scriptures that God said, "Let us make man in our image and according to our likeness, and let them have dominion." So God made man in the image of God. He made him male and female. He made them. So male and female are real things. They're ontological categories. They're not assigned at birth or anything like that. They are real things. Now, you can talk about gender as an expression of biology and of sex, and you could talk about gender as an expression of societal norms, and both of those things are important. But of course, gender is, generally speaking, something that very clearly derives primarily from biological sex, and there's a whole list of kind of things that go into determining expressions of one's sex through what we call gender. But I think it's also important to realize that we should also avoid gender absolutism, because the problem is that societies often define masculinity and femininity in different ways, and that's okay. If you're a biblical man, it was perfectly manly to rip your shirt open and start wailing and crying. If you are a John Wayne American, that might seem very odd and not very manly. But I assure you, the manliest of men in the Bible fell upon one another's breasts and wept openly. And that was a perfectly legitimate expression of masculinity. So I think part of the problem of a culture is we have a confusion, of course, about categories, but we also have an inability to be comfortable with the wide variety of expression of gender and masculinity and femininity. And if we were just a little bit more comfortable with being in our own bodies and our own skins, that might be a little bit healthier for us. And when God saw everything, when he saw that he had made them and given them to fill the earth and multiply and give it and have dominion, he saw that it was good and that it was very good. That is to say, the creation of man and woman, and male and female, as the capstone of God's creation is really an important part of what's going into our understanding of marriage. And in fact, the story of the creation of Adam and Eve And the purpose of humanity itself is that which is referenced most in the Orthodox wedding service. You'll hear it referred to explicitly at least 3 times in all the large prayers, priestly prayers that are said over a couple. Hopefully that's not a scandalous thing. Why is my computer not wanting? Okay. Now, we read in the next part of Genesis where it goes into further detail about Adam and Eve in particular. Before, it was just a creation of male and female at the end of the kind of God's works. Genesis 3 tells us kind of almost a different take on the whole story of creation. And in that, it says, God says it's not good for a man to be alone. So that's one of the first elements. That marriage is one of the remedies by which God helps correct the loneliness of the human being through that companionship that we talked about. There are other ways. We talk about monasticism. Monasticism, we don't have a whole class on it, but we'll reference it today because monasticism is basically a variant, if you will, of marriage. It's a life of communion and companionship with others. Even though monastic, the term monach means, monachos means one, means a hermit originally, but what we find is that monasteries in general are communal affairs. And even though a person doesn't marry, and therefore they're single or alone or a monastic, they are rarely ever actually alone. They're always in companionship with others. So companionship is an essential need. As I've said, referenced maybe in some other times, but it's worth noting again. Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, hell is other people. It's also heaven. And it's really kind of your disposition of your soul that determines which one of those two it's going to be. So in any case, the story of the creation of Eve and Adam and that relationship is shown in this way of in profound intimacy. And so when God creates Eve out of Adam's side, and the symbolism there can be used in many different ways, that kind of the most typical way, of course, is to recognize she doesn't spring from beneath him or from above him, but from his side. So they're meant to be comparable to each other, side by side, partners in life, etc. He sees her and says, this at last is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. We have communion with one another. We are of the same substance. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And then there's the reference, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. It's an interesting thing that here in this version, it's saying Adam said that. Instead of just kind of Moses as the narrator. Maybe that might be different from translation to translation. I'd have to go look. But that phrase, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, is also referenced throughout the wedding service of the Orthodox Church. And I think it's one of the most important things. Note that it doesn't say the mother shall leave her father and mother. That doesn't mean that she doesn't, but in particular, I think societally, it just seems to work where if the husband clings to his parents and not to his wife, there's going to be problems. I come from a traditional society, the Romanian community, and I can assure you that 9 times out of 10, if there's marital difficulty in that setting, it's often because of an intrusive mother-in-law or a relationship to parents that's not healthy. Parents need to let their kids go. And when they get married, let them become one flesh with their wife. No mother likes to see her son be taken away from her, and even the best mothers still feel that tug. And so it's a good lesson nonetheless. And I think Adam is foreseeing a lot of things. But of course, there's also kind of a prophecy quality here of who Christ is. Christ is the one who kind of leaves the bosom of the Father, so to speak, to join us here on earth and be united to us in one flesh in the incarnation. So there's also a prophetic quality here. And we're going to see that played out as Christ is the second Adam, but that means he's also then therefore the second bridegroom. He's the second husband, if you will, of humanity. And then lastly, now the two were naked, both Adam and his wife, and were not ashamed. It's an interesting thing. And of course, all little children, when they first pick up Bibles and read this, they're titillated by this, and they look at the pictures of fig leaves and think, ooh, what's that all about? But I think it's a beautiful thing in that when a husband and wife are together, it is kind of the one place in which their natural bodily sexuality can be experienced without shame. Doesn't mean that's people always do. Sometimes they still have lots of issues that they're working out, but it's meant to be the paradisical state between a husband and a wife where they can be completely vulnerable with each other, completely exposed to one another, and united to one another without shame, regret, without fear, without jealousy, all these kind of things. And today's hookup culture, people are rushing to that, and what that ends up doing is it flips the whole experience of intimacy upside down, so that I can't tell you all the different ways, right? It confuses the whole process. Instead of sexuality being a vulnerability and a moment of real intimacy, it becomes very impersonal. It becomes very mechanical. It becomes very selfish and self-oriented. And for those people who think this is the means by which I'm going to attract a stable mate, good luck. I think you're going to find that that's not a very effective way. And a lot of, both men and women feel that pressure. And unfortunately now it was at one time, maybe it was men were more predatorial and women were more submissive to that fact. But I think that that's evening out, unfortunately, in this culture. And so men feel that they have to perform, women feel that they have to, what's a nice way of putting it?
Put out.
I didn't say that, but they need to be accessible, I guess. And unfortunately, they're rushing into something that they don't actually need. They just they're being told by so many pressures, this is how you do it. But it should be the culmination of a married relationship, not the road to it. And it doesn't necessarily make for a healthy relationship down the road, especially when you've developed, shall we say, as the young people say, a heavy body count going into marriage. So part of the problem is that we have fallen into sin as human beings. Adam and Eve fell in their relationship. There's a whole long story that we could go into. I don't want to go into the whole fall. I do that when I do premarital counseling, because I think that the story of Adam and Eve is the prototype for all human sin, but in particular, it's very much the prototype for understanding what happens in marriages when marriages go wrong. So I have a whole lesson for that I do in premarital counseling that I don't want to do here. But just to point out, to say that one of the threats to us in our marriages is the force of sin, and that sin immediately degrades the human relationship, such that even marriages suffer. So, for example, part of the result of the fall, in the case of the women, is the suffering and the insecurity and the pain involved with childbirth, the fear of abandonment, the whole kind of culture in which we live in, which is called pro-choice, which is pro-abortion, is because that culture has come to accept the idea that you can't depend on anyone to ever take care of you. So, you need to be fully autonomous and free from the commitment of a child. And this is the direct result of the fall, I would say, and it's a very unfortunate one. By the way, are you guys hearing the sound of the noise of the refrigerator in the back there? I might have to take audio.
Yeah, a little bit.
I'm going to take off original sound now that I'm not playing music for you. Okay, that should be better. And for Adam, for man, the reverse is true. Man suffers in that he's in a constant state of insecurity as well. as he has to struggle to become a provider. A man's value in this world, as has been well attested to by numerous TikToks of late, is that men suffer because if a man does not have value, right, he cannot provide for his wife or his children, he has almost no value in the society. And there's a great deal of pressure and sorrow and isolation and yes, resentment. And this does result in things like toxic masculinity. But it's not just that men are jerks. It's just that men are being told, unless you provide value, and by that we mean generally economic value and stability to others, you really don't have a purpose, and this is very very unhealthy. And so we see that this is the story from the beginning, though. Adam is struggling to provide, fighting the earth, which was once meant to be his for dominion, and he had this good positive relationship with the animals and so forth. Now he has to struggle to the end of his days, and to the earth in the end he returns. So birth, school, work, death, that's the lot for us. So both of these are kind of the same problem in the end, the problem of insecurity, the problem of distrust of one another, the problem of fear. And of course, many marriages suffer, many marriages fail, and generally speaking, it has to do with that. If there's not security, if there's not love, if there's not respect for what each person is doing, eventually that hooked on a feeling experience is unhooked and set adrift, and that's very bad. Lastly, Adam called his wife's name Life. You may not have heard that translation because Eva means life in Hebrew. So if you read the Septuagint, it says Adam called his wife's name Zoe, which is Greek for life, because she was the mother of all living. So even though they are entering into a world tainted by death, and even though they themselves will suffer death and mortality because of sin, nevertheless, there is the hope of life. And so marriage holds with it this hope of continuing the generations going forward. All right. Now, some people might say, what about polygamy? Isn't that in the Bible? Yes, it's all over the Bible, but just so is sin. And so is sacrifice to idols, So there's lots of things that are in the Bible, but it doesn't mean that the Bible approves of them. In fact, polygamy is one of the biggest problems of the Bible. It's up there with idolatry and murder and covetousness and all the other things. The first polygamist, in fact, is the figure of Lamech, the kind of seventh grandson of Cain, the first murderer, and he becomes himself a murderer, and he's the first one described as having two wives whose names themselves are kind of sketchy and suspicious. One is adornment, the other is shadow. So it's kind of like jewelry and makeup, if you will, are the names of his wives. So like they are the image of kind of a sexualized womanhood, as opposed to, say, kind of the wholesome and innocent image of Adam and Eve. Abraham, of course, he has the problem where he loves Sarah, but he's not having any children, so he tries to do a workaround with the concubine Hagar. This causes an immense amount of trouble for him and his family down to the present day, such that the whole kind of story of the Jews versus the Arabs is kind of a story of Abraham, Isaac versus Ishmael, right? So throughout history, some have called the Arabic people the Ishmaelites, descended from that line. So that's not considered a great thing, but it's not so much that Hagar's obviously not like guilty of bringing wooing on Abraham or something. She's in that handmaiden position of not really having much of a choice. So it's just a troublesome thing in the whole thing. Jacob and Esau, of course, continue the story as they have issues. Jacob himself has two wives and two concubines, right? And from them come the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel do not come from one woman. They come from 4 different women. So Jacob is prolific in his husbandry and even his non-husbandry. So it's a difficult thing, and it's always kind of funny to me that the wedding service kind of tiptoes around that. It says, "May you be blessed like Jacob and Rachel," as it's remembering, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca. Isaac and Rebecca are the only couple. They're lifted as the prototype couple because they're the only purely monogamous couple among the patriarchs. Isaac loves Rebecca, it says, and that means he never took another woman or a concubine, had other children. So just her, and that's like lifted up appropriately as this paragon of virtue. But it just gets worse and worse. David, of course, commits the double sin of adultery and murder through his kind of polygamy, his desire for Bathsheba. Solomon has so many wives that they basically lose count. And of course, what this results in is huge dynastic problems, civil wars, different, sons vying against each other for position and power, epic level complications. So polygamy is not the biblical ideal. It's not even really something that we should say God approves of. It's that these men did these things. And I think we see wherever there is polygamy in practice, whether it be in fundamentalist Mormonism or modern day Wahhabism somewhere in the Middle East or Indonesia or whatever, polygamy is generally a bad deal for women. It's a bad deal for the men who don't have the means and the resources, because then it means that more women are kind of are treated like a resource that are funneled towards the rich and the powerful and generally older men of the community. So younger men are unable to, necessarily be with the one that they love, their childhood sweethearts. That's like an impossibility for a lot of those cultures. So Christianity, in many ways, by restoring the biblical ideal of monogamy through Christ as the one bridegroom for the one church, I think really did a solid for the women of the ancient world, because it restored to them the dignity of being the one wife of one husband, not to be thrown away, not to be divorced, not to be cheated on, which was pretty much the norm among pagans for sure, and was quite tolerated among even men, even though it's against the law in Judaism as well. They seem to get away with a lot of things, let's put it that way. All right. So the Lord found us upside down with our flesh dominating our spirits. By coming in the flesh, by taking one flesh with us, by being united to humanity, he radically changes the meaning of marriage and family. So our life is no longer that pagan arrangement or even that patriarchal relationship as it was in the Old Testament, but it has become something new, something restored, something beautiful. Therefore, St. Paul can say in Hebrews, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. So our life with one another as husband and wife is now special. It is sanctified. It is honorable. It is a blessed state. And so this is all laid out for you, just so that when you hear in the wedding service of the Orthodox Church, the reading in the epistle of St. Paul to the Ephesians in chapter 5, you will understand the context. Because a lot of people hear these words, especially the first two here, and lose their minds, usually politely enough, but you can see almost every wedding I do, you'll see somebody roll their eyes. Oh my gosh, how can they say it? Old-fashioned. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Are we really still in that kind of a place? Are we really still asking people to submit to their husbands? Yes, we are. Because what we're doing is trying to restore an image of Christ and his church. So if you read the whole epistle section here, first of all, if you go a few verses before it, you will see that it's part and parcel of the entire commandment to all Christians to submit to one another in humility. So it's one expression of our mutual submission as Christians. One way that you can submit yourself as a mutual Christian is giving deference to one another, always, giving preference to somebody else before yourself. That's something anyone can do for anybody else. And then St. Paul's going to go through all the kind of the basic relationships of human society and show how in each one of these you can actively you can participate in this humility through mutual submission. So he starts with the core relationship, which is marriage, of course. So the first one, therefore, is wives, submit to your husband. So it's a natural progression. So he explains it in a way so that we'll understand our relationship as being the church to Christ. So the wife is like the church submitting to Christ. And all he has to do, women are smart, right? Women understand relationships. They speak relationships from a very young age. When they're children, they're playing with dolls and talking about who's the mommy and who's the daddy, and while the boys are still banging things together and making growling sounds. So girls are smart. They speak in relationship. They understand it. Paul doesn't have to go too deeply into this. He just says, it's just like Christ in the church. The church submits to her husband. So should you treat your husband like the image of Christ. Easy. Most women, okay, I got it. He has to spend a much longer paragraph on the men, because men are basically stupid. They're growling and making banging sounds, and they need a honey-do list, right? All wives, don't get angry if your husband doesn't read your mind. Okay, he's not yet sanctified. He should. Yes, he should. He should try harder. I understand. But he's a dummy. You married a lovable dummy, just like you love that puppy dog in the window. Okay, give him a to-do list. He will knock it out of the park, because he'll be like, aha, finally somebody who speaks my language. A to-do list, because that's men need to be told, here is the goals, here's the objectives, this is your mission, accept it, right? So once men get that, they're off to the races, and they'll please you very, very well. So St. Paul does that. He speaks to-do list. He gives the husbands, this is what you got to do. Love your wives. How do you do it? Look at Christ. How did he love his wife, the church? He gave himself for her. He treated her good. He cleansed her. He washed her with the word. He showed kindness to her. He presented her to be glorious. He lifted her up. He exalted her, right? Love her. Love your wife. And then how else do you do that? Love her like you love your own body. Men are really good at seeking their own comfort, okay? They're really familiar with that task. Make her feel the same. Take good care of her. Treat her really kindly, just like you treat your own body. And then lastly, be ready to die for her. Be ready to die for her, because Christ died for the church. Sacrifice yourself for her. Fulfill your calling to be that provider, to be that defender, to be that protector, to whatever you need to do. Father Andrew Damick said on his podcast recently, or one of them, that he would love to be able to give a sermon one day at a wedding in which it was like basically 2 words: turn to the wife and say submit, turn to the husband and say die. Amen.
Yes.
Because that's it.
Yes.
It's in a nutshell. Of course, you'd have to have people who understand the whole story, right? But in the end, he says, this is a great mystery. And remember, this is the term we use for sacrament, mysterion. I speak concerning Christ and the church. The human marriage is an image and an icon of the relationship of God to his church through Christ. So if you want to understand what a marriage should look like, you have to understand ecclesiology, actually. There was a few years ago a movement called, I think it was called the Promise Keepers. It was a big Protestant revival for men trying to take up the mantle of healthy husbandship and manlyhood and all those things, which I think is a good thing. Problem is, if you're in that type of Protestantism, most of them don't have any ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is whatever I make of it, right? The church is whatever I make of it. If you can't identify what the church is, like you can't identify what a woman is, how far are you going to be able to go? So for an Orthodox Christian, this holds a lot of meat, because we understand what the church is. It's a visible corporate reality that we can be a part of physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, etc. It's a reality. So for us to understand, to be as Christ loves the church, wow. We see that in the iconography, we see it in the sacraments. That image is hammered home to us every time we walk into the building. So it means something a little bit more than just like, well, it's wherever you find a group of like-minded people that will read the Bible with you the way you read it. That's not what makes a marriage. That's what makes dating, right? I like this person, so swipe right. So I think it's important that you have the right ecclesiology so that you can have the right understanding of marriage, because your marriage should model the heavenly image of Christ and his church. And then lastly, he kind of ameliorates the whole thing by simply saying, nevertheless, love each wife, love his own wife as himself, and let each wife respect her husband. A good husband actually doesn't want you to submit to him on everything. Once in a while, he will, because sometimes there's like, you need to make a decision. He's like, just where do you want to eat? Just tell me, right? That's a good one. That's an easy one, right? Submit by just telling him where you want to go. But for the most part, a husband doesn't actually want you to be a doormat. He wants you to be strong and opinionated and wise and willing to tell him what you think, because you're the person who's most likely going to get him out of his biggest mistakes, right? And if you're the person who says, well, I was going to say something, too late, better that you can say, I told you so, than I was afraid to. You're a prophetic voice to the husband. You're like the voice of the Holy Spirit in this relationship. So don't be afraid. But the key is respect your husband. A man doesn't need you to be a submissive. He needs you to be respectful, simply because he's trying his hardest and the world hates him. He goes out into the world. He's trying to make money. Everybody's trying to take his job, knock him down, make him feel like crap, steal his whatever. Men live in a world of constant threats. That's the reality. We do. And, having somebody in our corner who's just like, thank you. Thank you for like spending your life energy, making sure I can, share this life with you, and we can have this home together and have these children together and have a good life. Just once in a while, a thanks. So many men are suffering because, man, they just don't get any acknowledgement at all from anywhere. And it's not that they're egotists. It's really not. It's just really hard. It's really hard out there. So if you can just love your husband and respect him, and husbands, just love her the way you would want to be loved yourself, you're going to solve so many problems. Ask yourself what you're doing in your relationship. Are you treating her the way you would want to be treated? Are you treating him the way you'd want to be treated? It's not really that hard. It's really not hard. Just spend some time. All right. Saint Tikhon of Zadonsk, a fairly recent saint and the patron saint of my alma mater, St. Tikhon Orthodox Seminary, said the husband and wife must lay virtue and not passion as the foundation of their love. That is, when the husband sees any fault in his wife, he must nudge her meekly, and the wife must submit to her husband in this. So don't be a real harsh critic. Be very kind, be super gentle. Most of the time, you don't have to say anything. Likewise, when a wife sees some fault in her husband, she must exhort him, and he is obliged to hear her. So it's the opposite. She should really encourage him. It's not nagging. It's not nagging. It's exhortation. Exhortation is what I do when I preach to you, and hopefully you don't find me nagging me when I preach. I hate when priests and preachers nag the community. You really should be doing this. I don't want to go to church and be nagged. I got enough of that in my own life. In this manner, their love will be faithful and unbroken, and thereby having mutually composed their happiness, they shall take pleasure in the virtue. So virtuous love. Seek to improve each other. Seek to uplift each other. I was asked this question. Actually, I wasn't asked. My best friend, who belongs to another church that has priests and sacraments, but I will not name it, was getting married, and at the rehearsal dinner, his priest, who I grew up knowing, because they were the kind of family that had the priest over, and I lived next door, so I got to know the priest actually, and he was able to come and out of retirement to do the wedding, and it was great. But somebody asked, Father, why is marriage a sacrament? And why do you need to do it in a church? And I felt bad because he really didn't have like an answer to that, which I thought was really weird. Yeah, I was kind of disappointed, honestly, because to me, I was like, I could think of three, but I'll just give you one, and that is simply marriage. And maybe this is why this is a church that doesn't have married priests. So even though I'm not naming it, for me, it's simple, because marriage is a priesthood. We call it in the Orthodox Church the nuptial priesthood. We'll talk about priesthood, I think, next week. You are there to sanctify one another. You are there to offer yourselves to each other and each other to the Lord. You're sacrificial, you're offering, you're praying. You are there to raise children up and to fulfill that priestly role of Adam and Eve on the earth, to fill the earth and bring dominion, to bring good order and righteousness and justice to it. So there's a lot. So it's definitely sacramental, because it's kind of in some ways, even though we could say the priesthood is the foundation for all these sacraments, because we're all participating in the priesthood of Christ, I would almost say that marriage even precedes that, right? Because Adam's priesthood is made complete in his marriage with Eve, right? It's not good that he was alone. So Christ's priesthood is meaningless without his unity with his wife, the church, if you will, the bride of Christ. So it's absolutely foundational to our understanding of the sacraments. So at the same time, Christian marriage is, because it has all these elements of restoring our humanity to its original priestly service and role in the creation, it also needs to be founded in Christ, right? He's not just the role model for us, but really it's the purpose. Our marriage should be not just because we love one another, but because we love the Lord and we want to grow in that love. And it's through our mutual love with one another, with a husband and wife, that we begin to work out our salvation, where we learn most of all how to stop being so darn selfish, how to be more concerned about other people, how to give our lives for another person. It's the way we carry our cross and fulfill our duty, which is partly why, in the wedding service, there's the crown. The crowning, which we'll talk about, symbolizes not only are you the kings and queens, but you're also the martyrs, and wearing a martyr's crown. You're learning to lose yourself for the Lord through each other. Now, we mentioned monasticism earlier. Monasticism is again kind of a variant, if you will, on the married life. A monastic tonsure is treated almost like a wedding service for monastics, in that they're going directly to Christ to be united with him, to become a bride of Christ. Even a monk has kind of that quality. So this is where kind of the gender ideas get kind of a little bit weird, but that's just a normal expression, because it's their love for the Lord that drives them. In St. Matthew, the Lord says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. We'll talk more about this in a minute. But his disciples said to him, if such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. They were so pessimistic about their chances of being happily married that they were like, well, gee, might as well not even be married. And the Lord doesn't say, no, you should really try to be married no matter what. He doesn't say that. He says, well, all cannot accept this saying, only to those to whom it has been given. So there are some people who really aren't meant to be married and aren't called to marriage. Marriage is a calling. I knew I wanted to get married when I was a young man. I mean, I knew it in my bones that was the life for me. And I still feel that way, even though if something bad should happen and if I outlive my wife, God helping, God will grant me the chance to go, live as a monk somewhere until I outlive my usefulness on this life. But that's because I don't want to be alone. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. So to be a celibate is to willingly make yourself a eunuch, to cut off the sexual life, to say, I'm not going to participate in the sexual life of marriage But that's only for those who are called to it. And of course, within the Orthodox Church, married men who are sexually active with their wives are able to be priests. We don't have a problem with human sexuality. We don't think it's a sin to be a human being and have a sexual life. You just have to do it in the right, justified, correct way. In fact, we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, St. Paul talks about this. He says, now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, he says, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. That is to say, it would be great if men could, be celibate. He approves of that. That's definitely an ascetic principle within Judaism and in Christianity at that time, which suggests that, and many people took up that life. But not everybody is called to that. So rather than have porneia, sexual immorality, abound, let each man have his own wife and let each woman have her own husband. So learn to curtail that sexual life into a sacred path. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Affection here is clearly being used euphemistically. Affection is talking about sexual activity, right? Of course, it also means non-physical sexual intimacy, and part of my premarital education is I talk a lot about that and say, listen, if you really want to have a wonderful, comfortable, healthy, intimate relationship with your wife or your husband, you've got to learn how to be physically intimate with each other without it leading to sex, because you need to be comfortable just being physically with each other without it becoming a thing, right? Leading to something. So affection is both. It is both, but it does clearly here include sexual activity, right? And so he says, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. He's not saying that during Lent you can't give your wife a back rub, or she can't massage your feet at the end of a long day. By all means, continue to do that, right? What he's talking about is sexual abstinence during a time for fasting and prayer. And come together again. So don't cut yourself off forever, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. So again, if you can do it, fine. If you're called to do it, great. But don't feel obliged, and don't say, well, I'm not getting what I need, so I'm going to go outside of the marriage, right? Or do something like that. That's not going to help your situation. But he says, I wish that all men were even as myself. That is to say, he's at this point in his life celibate, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. So it's a recognition that there are different ways of life. There are some people who will be asexual as well. There are people, there seems to be, again, a lot of absolutism right now in the discussion of sexuality in this country. Like you either have to be hetero or homosexual or something like that, and then there's all these other categories in between. But one of them that doesn't get enough attention, I think, is the asexuals out there, people who just don't want to have sex. God bless them. The Bible says you're in a good position, and no one should make you feel like you should repent of that, because it's actually some of the major martyrs and great martyrs and virgin martyrs of the early church were simply men and women who were like, I really don't want to get married. I want to just live my life for Christ. I want to live my life for prayer. And they weren't interested. And the pagan culture wanted them to no, you need to marry because there's money at stake and things like that, right? Because it was a big part of the kind of the way the culture worked. And of course, they wanted their, and so today, it may not be that, but you may have parents wanting grandchildren, right? Or people thinking you're weird because you don't want to settle down. I think now, most of the time, people just figure that you just don't want to get married, or you're just being active in your own way. But if you don't want to be active, you don't want to get married, don't get married. That's perfectly fine. You may not be called to a monastic life. You may not want to dress in black robes, but you can certainly live a celibate life with great dignity, with chastity and holiness. Just possess yourself. I know a priest who's now a bishop, who basically said, I just wanted to read my books. It's like it's just too much work to get in a relationship. I was like, I get it. Yeah, and you might get to that point. You may get to the point in your marriage where it's more of just companionship anyway, which is fine, which is good. Saint Ignatius, who talks about marriage in the beginning of the 2nd century, he's a disciple of Saint John the Baptist and is considered an apostolic father. He speaks of this also, talking about you can remain in a state of purity, just don't be boastful about it. And if you get married, continue to do that as well. But in any case, it becomes both men and women who marry to form their union with the approval of the bishop, and that their marriage may be according to God and not after their own lust. Let all things be done to the honor of God. So we see from this early time period, the idea of the church sanctifying a marriage became normative. There is some discussion about Christians kind of not having church weddings for many centuries. There was a good episode on this on Lord of Spirits where they talked about marriages recently, or just a few weeks, maybe last month or something. But they made the good point that, like, in the pagan world, pagan marriage ceremonies were big deals. And I think you can still see this if you see like say a traditional Hindu wedding. It's got all the elements of ancient paganism on full display for you.
Some of our Christian weddings.
Some of the Christian weddings today also do, right? So early Christians would not have been like, we'll do everything else the normal way in church, except for our weddings. We'll still do that the pagan way. So I don't think they were ever doing that. I think from the very beginning, Christians understood that getting married in the church was a special thing. I think part of the reason that we see the service developing later is because it just over time became its own thing, separate from the liturgy, where at first it was just a blessing kind of added on to the liturgy. And of course, in the first few centuries, many people were converting as adults and had maybe been married before they entered the church, and the church didn't remarry them. And that's one of the things we'll talk about if we get to it today. Is you don't need to get remarried the Orthodox way if you're married and you convert to Orthodoxy. Some people feel like, oh, does that mean I need to get my marriage crowned in the Orthodox Church for it to be legitimate? No, you come in as a married person. You're already one flesh.
Arizona.
Yeah, you're already. Yeah, it conveys.
You have the sacrament before you're Orthodox.
In essence, yeah, even if we would not recognize that sacrament, if it was done today for an Orthodox Christian, like you can't, we'll get to that. I don't want to get too much into that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about divorce again as well. St. Paul talks about divorce and mixed marriages. He says, not to the marry I command, yet not I, but the Lord. So before he was talking about this, I give as a concession, not as a command, meaning he was saying, this is just my opinion. Now he's saying, this is from the Lord. A wife is not to depart from her husband, but even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband, and a husband is not to divorce his wife. So don't divorce, but even if you do your best to remain unmarried. Don't go chasing after another person. But to the rest I say, not the Lord. So now this is his opinion as opposed to a commandment. If any brother who has a wife who does not believe and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. So if somebody enters into the church, they're a pagan or even a Jew, and the wife is not interested or the husband is not interested, he's saying, you don't need to divorce them. Okay, you don't need to split from them. And this is a real issue today too. There are people wanting to come to Orthodoxy and the spouse is dead set against it. And they're like, I don't like this. This is weird. It's not my church. It's not what I grew up with. It's not how I understand Christianity. We get that. We appreciate that. We understand that. And we don't want you to, feel bad for that. We want you to kind of like discover us, find out, we're not a cult. We're just regular people worshiping in a really old school way. That's all. And we love to share what we've learned about the history of our faith and the life of the Holy Spirit and the life of the church for the last 2,000 years. So it's an open invitation for everyone. A woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. So you're supposed to stay. Why? Because the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. So you come into the church, your baptism baptizes not only you, but your marriage. It doesn't baptize your spouse. That's an important point. But it baptizes your marriage. So you come in as a married person, you're baptized as a married person. That marriage, the children that come out of that are considered to be blessed, right? They're legitimate. They still need to be baptized or chrismated as is appropriate to be full members of the church. That is an important point. And because there's been some figures recently who try to suggest that they count, they're good enough. That's not correct. They still need to be received. But if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. So if this is one case in which divorce is accepted, one case in the New Testament gospel is where the Lord says, except for sexual immorality or adultery. So if somebody cheats on you, that's kind of broken the covenant between you. If you can stay and you can forgive and stay. But if you can't, if they've run off, you can divorce them, no sin. Sad, tragic, but it will not be held against you. This is another one. If they don't believe in God, if they are an atheist or a pagan, and they decide they don't want anything to do with you anymore, don't feel obliged to stay with them or keep that marriage afloat. You are not bound to them, right? God has called us to peace. If you can, because you will. I have seen many people come in slowly but surely, their spouses join them eventually in the church, some longer than others. Because, verse 16, how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? You just don't know. God's plan is in his hands and guided by the Holy Spirit. I don't try to manage these things for people. I just say, take your time. Take your time, just be the best spouse you can possibly be. Let your conduct win them over to your faith. And if you don't bear a good witness, why would they want to become Orthodox? Why would they? If you become some kind of self-righteous jerk, what are you doing? Your behavior needs to be upright and upstanding and good and humble, most of all. There's a great story about St. James the Persian, the great martyr, in which he was a courtesan, so not a courtesan, a courtier. That's the right term. Sorry, very different. A member of the court of the Persian king. I guess they would have been some kind of shah or padishah at that time, whatever. And he was drawn into kind of just get along and go along type of thing to start joining them in their pagan-y celebrations, Zoroastrian celebrations, whatever it was. It was not Christian, but he was a Christian. And his wife and his mother got wind of this, and they were scandalized that their son would apostatize in such a flagrant manner and treat the gift of Christ as such a trifling. And so they wrote him a scathing letter and said, we basically, how could you do this? We can't even count you a son or a husband anymore until, repent, or you're basically dead to us, which nowadays people say, oh, they're so judgmental. How could you do that? But he was throwing away his eternal life and throwing away everything that meant anything to them. I mean, if you threw away your marriage, you wouldn't say, and your husband would say, what? Don't judge me. Don't judge me. I was just having fun. You'd say, you're a cad. You don't deserve it. You don't deserve her. She's willing to accept you if you repent. So that's what's going on here. And so he is struck by the letter, and he takes it seriously, and he doesn't get self-righteous and indignant. And he starts to pray that God would forgive him for his sins. And the fellow soldiers hear him, and they narc on him. They tell the emperor or whatever, and so he decides he's going to see it through, and he becomes a martyr. Great way to die for your faith, but also for your marriage. and he's really an upstanding figure. Luckily, we don't live in a country here in the United States where you're going to probably be put to death, but there are people in other countries where this is still happening, and this does happen on a regular basis throughout the world. And there are many ways in which it can happen in a lesser extent in this country, right? People might you might lose your job, or you might, people might decide, well, I can't be around somebody who doesn't believe what I believe anymore, right? Christians are tolerant of all kinds of beliefs. You can think whatever you want. We're not here to make your life miserable. We're not going to cut ourselves off from you, but it doesn't mean we're going to say whatever you think is okay. I don't expect you to agree with everything I say just because I have these beliefs. Don't expect me to do the same. But there are a lot of people in this world that if you don't agree with them, you are persona non grata. So be careful who you share your faith in the mystery of Christ with. Here's another slide if you're interested. There's kind of a background theory. Was St. Paul single? Was he a widower? Was he married at any time? There's different arguments about that. He seems to understand the married relationship pretty well. I don't think there's any particular answer to this, but there is early traditions that held that he had been married at some point, that he might have even had his wife with him on some journeys, but at some point he was a widower. Other later fathers expressly denied it because they preferred St. Paul as kind of a epitome of more of a monastic figure or a celibate figure, so they preferred to think of him as not being married. The argument that he was married, besides the scriptural references, is that as a rabbinical student, it would have been expected of him to have been a married man within Judaism. So that's, take it or leave it. I don't think there is a right or wrong answer other than what we'll find out in the kingdom of heaven. But in terms of, it doesn't really matter.
Who wrote Hebrews?
Oh, yeah. Who wrote Hebrews? Okay, so here's a couple big texty things, but this is just about mixed marriage from statements of the church. First, I'll read the one on the right, the OCA guidelines, which were just updated, and I haven't had a chance to change them on the slide, but there wasn't too much difference. What we understand as a mixed marriage is a marriage between an Orthodox Christian and a non-Orthodox Christian baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity, who confesses the unique lordship of Jesus Christ. The church tolerates this because of her pastoral concern and love for the faithful. Thus, a mixed marriage is not the norm, but is permitted in the hope that the non-Orthodox spouse will seek entrance into the church. So for a person in that position who wants to marry somebody who's a Christian but not Orthodox, they would have to get a petition for mixed marriage. The Orthodox partner should not consent to have their children baptized outside the Orthodox Church as a pre-marriage agreement. Hypocritically, maybe, we're perfectly fine if you want to sign one that says you will baptize them Orthodox, but we would not want an Orthodox person to agree to being
Consistent.
Well, when you think you're the church, it kind of follows. Yeah. So toleration of a mixed marriage does not extend to marriage between an Orthodox Christian and a non-Christian, non-Trinitarian person, right? So even though they might have Christian in their language or their name, like Christian Scientists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, Mormons, Unitarians, etc., these are not Trinitarian Christians. Therefore, they would not be considered Christians for this purpose. Muslims, of course, Muslims right out, Hindus, etc. Active participation of non-Orthodox clergy in the service, as in all the mysteries of the Orthodox Church, is not allowed. We're not concelebrating with them. Conversely, Orthodox clergy may not participate in non-Orthodox services and rites. However, if they have somebody who attends and you have the reception and they would like to say something or even offer the blessing of the food, usually that's fine. It's not part of the liturgical service. It's not concelebration in that case. And I have seen that happen and done without too much of a problem. But they would not participate in the wedding itself. Some people have multiple weddings to accommodate both sides of the family. If that is it's not normative, obviously, and the bishops would not normally be happy with an Orthodox person participating in a non-Orthodox marriage service. If that does happen, please go case by case with your priest and your bishop to talk about how you can work that out. It is probably for me as a priest one of the most difficult situations that I have as a pastor, because you don't want to make marriage is already hard enough for people to want to commit to nowadays. You don't want to make like the wedding such a stressor that people don't even want to get married in the church, right? My job is to make it as easy as possible for you to be blessed by God, right? I don't want to make it difficult. So sometimes these things happen, and they're complicated and they're difficult, and we do have these kind of akaravia, the strictness of the canons, but there is some economia, and we try to do our best to make it, especially the bride, happy, because usually that's where the bigger problem lies, but even the husband might have some opinions, and want to make sure that that happens well. The Council of Crete took place in 2016. It also affirms some of the same ideas. Marriage between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Christians is forbidden, normally according to canonical akravia or strictness. However, with the salvation of man as the goal, the possibility of the exercise of ecclesiastical economia in relationship to impediments to marriage must be considered by the Holy Synod of each autocephalous Orthodox Church, each local church, according to the principles of the Holy Canons and in the spirit of pastoral discernment. So even if you go to, say, one church and they're really strict about it there may be another church where they have a different set of economia, and some people do, honestly, they do sometimes shop around, and I mean, that's how it is. So we here at St. Mary's probably are somewhere in the middle of our strictness as the OCA guidelines, as you see on the right. Marriage between Orthodox and non-Christians is categorically forbidden in accordance with canonical akravia. Again, this does not apply to a person who is married to a non-Christian who then becomes Orthodox, who converts. Once a person is in the Orthodox Church, they should be united with a person of faith. Sometimes if that happens anyway, somebody's not baptized or is not a member of a church or is an avowed atheist or something like that, we have to figure out a way to work that out. Sometimes there's some penance involved. Sometimes they're finally willing to accept a crowning of the marriage in some case. Sometimes they're willing and they convert and they become actually really good members of the church. So we try for that end, because the goal is, again, the salvation. When people, I think, realize that we're not here to make their life difficult, we're actually here to bring them the fullness of what marriage could and should be. When we want their marriages to succeed and overcome all the things flying at them from every direction, the church is your huge ally in making your marriage work. And, statistically speaking, Christian churchgoers have a much lower rate of divorce because they have a lot of resources available and a lot of guidance and wisdom to help them overcome standard problems that everybody experiences. But if you're married to somebody who doesn't buy any of that and doesn't go into for any of that, little things can drive them off the cliff. And you'd be like, I thought we were on the same page. And like, no, they weren't with you on that. That was their exit route, their exit ramp. Malachi speaks to us, the prophet, about the tragedy of divorce as an image of the falling away of Israel from its faithfulness to God. You do these things which I hate. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and moaning because of troubles, yet still thinking it is worthy to look upon your sacrifice or take it as an acceptable from your hands. And you say, why? Because the Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth, whom you have forsaken. Yet she is your companion and the wife of your covenant. He did not make another, but did he not make another having a remnant of his spirit? Yet you ask, what else does God seek but offspring? But take heed to your spirit and do not forsake the wife of your youth. But if you hate her and send her away, says the Lord God of Israel, ungodliness will obscure your thinking, says the Lord Almighty. So take heed to your spirit that you do not forsake her. So this is in a case where people would divorce their wife because they were not getting the offspring they wanted. They were not getting, like Henry VIII, classic example, right? I don't understand how a church can be founded on the basis of a man like that, but apparently there is one out there, and it's shown the fruits thereof. We have to learn. We have to learn from these scriptures and take them to heart. Okay, we have a high standard of fidelity, speaking of that, in the Orthodox Church. Premarital sex is forbidden by the Church. Sexual unity should be offered uniquely to one's spouse. It's not like testing out the tires on a car, okay? You shouldn't justify and say, well, I want to know if we're going to, be compatible or whatever like that. If probably if your plumbing works by this point, I would hope, that you don't need to like road test it, okay? If you want the relationship to be founded on strength, it will not be founded on dissipation through premarital sex. It will be founded through the mutual respect and integrity of waiting for marriage. And I know it's very difficult and it's very hard, but it can be the best decision you can make for your relationship, because it really tells each other that you're there for each other and not because you're getting something out of it. Sexual activity is as close to an ecstatic drug high as you can get. In fact, people have said that drugs are addictive simply because they trigger the same parts of our brain that sex does. So if you think about it that way, if you're having sex before marriage, you're driving drunk. You're essentially high, and you're unable to see the person for who they are. You're seeing them as a fix, their sexual fix. So learn to abstain before marriage so that you will get to know the actual person, who they actually are. And then when you come together, it will be wonderful because you actually love that person, not just the high that you're getting from their bodies. So it's a meaningful thing, and it really does matter. If you made the mistake, you'll go to confession, you'll figure it out. It's forbidden, it is forgivable, but don't repeat it. If you understand, invest that energy, that intense sexual longing, into getting to know the other person as a full human being made in the image of God, and save it, invest it like you would into a certificate of deposit with a high rate of return, which it will in your marriage. It will. Divorce and remarriage are forbidden except in extreme situations such as sexual infidelity. I would include in there, I also mentioned non-belief, but third of all, I think it's important to mention physical abuse. And to a certain extent, emotional, psychological abuse, because that can be really, if somebody's tormenting you, you're not bound to stay with them. They are not a person in communion with the church if they are beating you or belittling you or abusing you. Okay. If I find out that somebody's doing that to one of my spiritual daughters, I have a bat and a sword and some other things, and I'm willing to use them. Don't mess with my daughters, spiritual or otherwise.
One way I've heard this described, Father, is that the one flesh reality of marriage also means that a marriage can die from these reasons that you say, and we Orthodox are often accused by Roman Catholics of permitting divorce, which is as if it's just an option. Permitting divorce, yeah. And when in reality, it's a real observation that marriage has died. Yeah, it's a recognition that this covenant, this relationship has been sundered beyond repair. Somebody who's physically abusive and seriously psychologically abusive. I mean, a person can be a jerk without it being a pattern of abuse, right? They can just have a bad day and say some nasty things. I think we've all been there. Yeah, I've been there. Most men have been there. They raise their voice, and that can be intimidating and scary. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about somebody who's like, gaslighting you and just like really just messing with you and just belittling you, making you feel all the kind of things. There's no covenant. There's no real marriage going on, right? So yeah, the divorce there is a recognition that you need to get that person out of there before permanent damage is done. And sometimes there is permanent damage done. A person is traumatized maybe, or their children have been traumatized. It's a real serious thing. So
I am not pro-divorce, but I am probably far more willing to bless somebody to seek a divorce. And I have said on numerous times to someone, you need to, after you talk to me, you need to be talking to an attorney. My father was a general practice attorney, and he helped women escape seriously abusive situations. As a kid, I would stumble upon his case files if he brought them home and didn't hide them well enough, and see pictures of battered women. And my father was, threatened with physical violence by these men. It's a real thing. So men who do that need to be taken out of that situation. They don't deserve to be considered married men. And for men like my father who defended those women, kudos, you've earned your crowns. Second and third marriages in the church involve penance and a separate rite. It's not exactly a separate rite, but the prayers that are said at a first marriage, some of them are removed and replaced with kind of a penitential prayer. And the second and third marriage rites, fourth marriages are right out. I feel like it's the hand grenade of Antioch, and that 4 is right out. The counting shall be 3. But the second or third, which is allowed out of mercy, because you never know, somebody might lose. There might be, in the old world, people died young, so you could live a long time and have these experiences. But it's a penitential rite. Now, if it's one person is being remarried a second time or a third time, and the other person this is their first time being married, we would still do the first marriage rite for the person being married for the first time. We're not penalizing them for the other person's past. So just so you know. Marriages outside the church can be recognized as natural marriages by the church for converts. Marriages are elevated in the church to a sacramental status. Marriage is more, not less than a contract. Marriages are also done normally in the church. Some people want to have weddings on a beach or at some beautiful venue or things like that. We would not normally do that. There is a workaround. You can always build a chapel. We had a gazebo in my first parish that we built and made it into a mini chapel, and we did weddings outside once. Didn't work out though. Marriage didn't work out, so that was a lesson learned. But I don't understand why people would want to get married on a beach, because if you ever spent time on a beach, and I love going to the beach, you can't hear anything like 5 feet away. The sound of the waves is so loud. The wind is carrying. I mean, you can't hear anything. There's sand everywhere. It's terrible. Yeah, what the heck? I mean, I don't get it. Go for your honeymoon there. Yeah. Your friends will thank you. Or build a nice little gazebo and make a chapel on the beach. Here's another bit from the Council of Crete. We're not going to get through everything today. I'm sorry about that. The pressing issue in society today is marriage, which is the center of the family, and the family is what justifies marriage. Pressure to recognize new forms of cohabitation constitutes a real threat for Orthodox Christians. This variously manifested crisis in marriage and family profoundly concerns the Orthodox Church, not only in light of negative consequences for the fabric of society, but also in light of its threat to particular relationships within the bounds of the traditional family. The main victims of these trends are the couples themselves, but especially the children, since regrettably, the children often endure great suffering from an early age, which nonetheless bearing no responsibility for the situation. Therefore, a civil marriage between a man and a woman registered in accordance with the law lacks sacramental character, since it is a simple, legalized cohabitation recognized by the state, different from a marriage blessed by God and the church. The members of the church who contract a civil marriage ought to be regarded with pastoral responsibility, which is necessary to help them understand the value of the sacrament of marriage and the blessings connected with it. Before I read the last part, this is a real issue in particular in Europe, where the Orthodox churches, many people now get married civilly and only later get married in the church, if at all. And that's common here in this country to a certain extent, but it's even more prevalent there, especially during communism and the secularizing forces of those countries, have made the legal marriage completely separated from the church marriage. In this country, the priest can still act as an agent of the state. Some priests have decided that they don't want any part of that because they don't want to sully themselves by being involved with an institution that also recognizes same-sex marriages, for example. I am not willing to throw that away because I think it's a great privilege of our nation that they recognize that the local pastor or priest can act as an agent of the state in certifying a marriage. So I'm not going to cede territory that's been recognized and granted to the clergy. I think that's a mistake. It doesn't mean it by no means requires me to participate in any type of marriage that I would not be able or willing to do as an Orthodox priest. The state doesn't have any authority to tell me you have to conduct this or that kind of marriage. It's recognizing that because of my status as a clergy, I'm capable of doing those things. So in any case, sometimes people do get married civilly before they get married in the church for various reasons. Some reasons are honestly pretty good reasons. Maybe there's like an insurance reason or a citizenship issue that needs to be addressed sooner than later, and they're not ready to do the full church wedding. There are workarounds for that pastorally as well. And I would say even if a couple is decided, well, we're going to get married, Father, but we're moving in together now. I have told them, I said, well, you're not able to take communion, and I would ask, and if you want me to do the marriage, I want you to be legally married from the get-go. If you're going to live together, you have to be at least civilly married to recognize that you have taken that step of commitment to each other at least. And you're still going to be under penance in the process because it needs to be recognized. And it's important. Some people will say, well, can you just marry us in the church, but not legally? And there's some incentives that people have for that, which I sympathize with, because especially older people might have benefits accrued to them over their lifetime from maybe a previous marriage. And if they get remarried as a widower or a widow, they might lose those benefits. So they choose to cohabitate instead of getting married. I still can't marry you in the church without you being legally married. And it's important, because if I marry you without you being legally married and you decide to split it off, there's no protections. I can't come in and say, well, you owe half, or you have to pay child support, or you have to pay alimony. I don't have that authority. Only the state has that authority. So I am not going to set somebody up for a risky position. That would be irresponsible and negligent of me as a pastor. I want my spiritual children to be protected. And that is what marriage laws are there for. They're not there to make your life difficult. They're there to protect you in the case of something which may not be your own fault. What if somebody does die, and then, what about inheritance, escrow, things like that? That can be very complicated. So all those things matter and are important. Lastly, the church does not allow for her members to contract same-sex unions or any other form of cohabitation apart from marriage. This would include marriage with somebody who's transgendered. So even if they identify as the opposite sex, they are not, and they would not be eligible for marriage in the Orthodox Church. The Church exerts all possible pastoral efforts to help her members who enter into such unions understand the true meaning of repentance and love as blessed by the Church. If your truth is love, well, you have a very bland and undeveloped idea of love, because Greek has at least 5 or 6 different words for love. So maybe we should take some biblical Greek. So there's all kinds of different kinds of love, and they're not all the same, and they're not all equal. And in the Orthodox Church, we're trying to lead you to a Christ-like love, which transcends even all those Greek categories as well.
I love pizza.
I love pizza. Philo pizza, something. I'm a philopizza. Father Alexander Schmemann was married to beautiful Matka Juliana, who I got to know a little bit before she passed away. She was at the Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Elwood City for many years. A marriage which does not constantly crucify its own selfishness and its own self-sufficiency, which does not die to itself that it may point beyond itself, is not a Christian marriage. If anything, I want my daughters to see my marriage to my wife as not about me and my wife. It's about pointing to the way to heaven, pointing the way to Christ, learning how to be self-sacrificing. If it's just about, oh, two people loved each other and they had a really great life together here on earth, that's death. That's the grave. That story ends in a tomb. I want them to see well beyond that. I want them to see the story that goes forever and gets only better. Family itself can become a form of idolatry. You know, you hear people say this, I would do anything for my family. Anything? Really? You know?
Murder?
And I get that. I would kill somebody to protect my family, and I'm a priest. And people say, well, Father, you're a priest. I'm like, yeah, but I'm a husband first, a father first, then I'm a priest. I can stop being a priest and still live a happy life. But I can't stand and watch somebody kill my wife or daughters or son in front of me. You know, I'm going to defend them. So that's important. But I'm not going to kill myself through idolatry, you know, or through sacrificing my faith or giving up my eternal salvation for the sake of my family by saying, yeah, church doesn't matter. My wife doesn't like it. We don't have to go to church anymore. Or my kids, they don't really like it. So, you know, I'm just going to kind of ghost away. You know, family should not be an end of itself. Marriage needs to be for the glory of God. Happiness is a symptom of a good marriage. It is not the goal of a good marriage. Okay. The cross is the path. The cross sounds like a horrible path, but it actually can be a very joyful one. And because we can endure a whole lot of difficulty and a whole lot of suffering when we have the vision of what's beyond, right? The vision of the kingdom of heaven. So in Christian marriage, three things are united: the husband, the wife, and God. We are being united together with that divine life, infusing and enlightening and energizing our marriages as Christian couples. If problems are there, one of those three people has probably stepped out of the room. So even if a husband and a wife are still in the room together, if they've lost God, they may wonder, why are things not going so well? And if the husband or the wife is faithful to God, but the husband or wife has lost their faithfulness to the situation, obviously problems ensue. Marriage and monasticism are two paths to salvation. Not everyone is called to the same struggle. Single life also needs to involve a community of persons. So even if you don't get married, still don't be isolated. Be a part of a community, either your local church community or a monastic community, or both. There are a lot of single people who become friends of monasticism. There's in fact a whole community of what's the New Skeet community that has like a third. It has a monastery for women, a monastery for men, and then it has the Friends of New Skeet, which are like married people. Kind of.
It didn't work out.
Oh, it didn't work out?
No, I think they've closed that.
They've closed that off. Well, nonetheless, it was a nice idea. Like the idea that like you could still be connected to a monastery in some way. Many monasteries have a network of families that regularly go as pilgrims. That's the right relationship, as a pilgrim.
Right. Not as a parish.
Not as a parish. Have your own parish separate from the monks and nuns. They have their own life that they need to live. It's like living in their house too long. OCA guidelines: Orthodox Christians who marry outside the Orthodox Church thereby exclude their marital life from the life of the church. So don't get married outside the church. After a period of penance, they may be restored to Eucharistic fellowship by recommendation from the priest and approval. Normally, an act of such a sort would involve a marriage rite approved by the hierarch. And again, priests are reminded that converts are not to be remarried when they embrace the Orthodox faith. There are some jurisdictions where that is happening. That is not normal. That is not canonical.
Is that Elvis wedding?
That's an Elvis. That's my back screen too. Yes, the Elvis, the quick wedding. Don't get married in Vegas and then think that you're good. You know, if you get married by Elvis, you still need to come to church and get married by Not me, but the king, the real king, the king of kings.
The king is not let through.
Let's talk about kids. We have a few minutes left. We're not going to get to the sacramental side of marriage today. I think I'm going to let you guys out at 4:30. But just we round out again the theology of marriage. Childbearing is a means of salvation, right? It's a way in which we die to ourselves so that others may live. So it is an act of the cross. But it is not the only way for marriage to be life-giving, right? Procreation is a command given to Adam and Eve. We should not enter into a wedding and a marriage with the idea that we don't plan on, we're not going to have kids. That might be the case of like an older couple getting married who are past the age of being able to do that. But a young couple should not enter into marriage saying, oh, no, we're not going to have kids. Like, well, what if it happens? You can say we're not in a rush to try, or we're not going to like actively try. And even that's a little suspicious, honestly, but to say we're not going to, like, we're going to take measures to prevent that from ever happening.
Be open to it.
That you should be open to it. Now, there might be some mitigating reasons, like genetically, there might be some like chemistry ready to blow up on you if that happens. But usually that's not the case. And sometimes that's why they used to have those like, blood tests and things like that before you got married to make sure. But we pray through the marriage service that you may be granted children for the continuation of the race and for all petitions which are good for your salvation. But there's also one of the clauses that are there that you may have children which are expedient for you. So like, we don't expect you to like overpopulate so that you can't afford to like clothe and feed your children. We don't, there's no virtue in having so many kids that you're in the poorhouse. Have as many kids as you can afford to do, which is more than you think. It's less than you fear, but more than you think. So have kids, repopulate at least yourself, right? And realize, in the old days, people had a lot of kids because half of them were going to die before they ever had a chance to reproduce themselves. It was very common, but population is growing, and there are reasons to maybe say, maybe we don't want to have a huge family, but definitely, have a reasonable number of children and continue the human race. Don't be afraid or ashamed of that.
And don't engage in child idolatry. I heard a presentation by Timothy Mamalakis about that children are like icons. We don't, break them, iconoclasm. We don't worship them. We venerate them.
Good. Did everybody hear that on there? Children are like icons. We don't break them like iconoclasts, but we don't worship them like idols.
Right.
So we have to we venerate them properly. We show them good respect, and we elevate them and exalt them so that they can be glorified in the image of Christ, right?
And your earlier slide that said, the unity is husband, wife, and God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important for a parent to realize that his closest relationship, the one flesh, is with the spouse.
Yeah, not with the children.
We love our children, we venerate them, but you can go too far.
Yeah.
At the expense of the marriage.
Yeah, and some people will, on the flip side of this, as well, I'm saying, have children as much as you can. There are some people that won't be able to, or they'll have great difficulty doing it, and they will pursue any means to have their own biological child. We don't encourage that either, because there's many problems with that. I don't know if I have it on the slide here, but like things like in vitro fertilization are very problematic, because what happens is they will fertilize a whole number of eggs because it's expensive and difficult to do in the first place. And then, so let's say you implant a couple of them and have kids, but you got like a dozen left over, or 5 left over, even 1 left over, frozen in a tube somewhere. You've now basically committed a form of abortion if you let those not, go. So it's very troublesome and problematic. Other things like artificial insemination become problematic because you're kind of introducing another person. Better to adopt a child who has no means. And of course, adoption has become a racket that's become very difficult to be involved in. Fostering is by no means an easy option, and I think you should not assume that you're capable of it. We have someone in our class who has very profound experience with that and how difficult that is. And so maybe being somebody's crazy uncle and aunt will be your calling, and you won't be the direct parent, or maybe you'll be a really good godparent. But what God gives, if God gives you a bounty, struggle to be worthy of it. If God doesn't give you any, struggle to accept it and to make it into something that glorifies God. You will not be missing out on life because of your lack of having children. And you will not be missing out on life because you had too many children. You will be missing out on life if you didn't use that experience to glorify God and to take that path of salvation that was presented for you. Children are teachers on our path to virtue. Children have a great benefit in that they will humble us / humiliate us. They will bring us down a peg. They will teach us how weak we are. They will teach us how patient God is with us, because we realize how patient we have to be with them. And they also teach us to remind us that we ourselves need to be like little children to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So whoever breaks a child, shall we say, whoever abuses a child or turns a child away from God through their harsh treatment, better for them that they be, never be born or have a millstone hung around their neck and thrown into the sea, right? So take this gift of children to be so very, very valuable. It is one of the greatest callings that you can have as a human being, is to be a parent. It is noble, it is glorious, and it is challenging. It wouldn't be glorious if it wasn't. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it. Some people are, and then they're not doing it. Again, OCA Synodal affirmations on procreation and parenting. I'm not going to go too much into this. You can look at this slide on pause later if you like. But again, procreation should take place in the context of a marital union. We've seen a lot of marriage, children out of wedlock. That's not good for children. That makes life much more difficult for them, economically, psychologically, emotionally, you name it. Be married, have children, get it the right order of life. Go to school, graduate, get a job, get married, have children. If you do those things in that order, your life is more than likely going to turn out okay. Do it out of order, and you're going to have problems. You're going to have problems no matter what, but you're going to definitely have problems if you get that out of order. Married couples may express their love and sexual union without always intending the conception of a child, but only those means of controlling conception within marriage are acceptable which do not harm a fetus already conceived. So no abortifacient type of birth control. I once told a couple, and I've probably said it more than once, but an important part about procreation is that you practice ahead of time, that then you do it, and then you review the process later. So that's part of it. You're binding each other still in your intimacy, even after childbirth with each other, even if you're not intending to have more. Married couples may use medical means to enhance conception, but the use of semen or ova other than that of the married couple who both take responsibility for their offspring is forbidden. So again, donors, things like that, better not to play God like that with those kind of things. Better to adopt or just try natural means as much as possible. And if not, accept. I know there are people who just can't accept that, and they're like, I want to have my own child. I will not love the child unless it's my own offspring. And well, this is again a case of childolatry, if you will. Speaking of parenting, convinced of God-revealed truths, we offer the following affirmations. The family of father, mother, and children with extended family of grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins is to be supported and protected as the basic condition of life. I like that they use the extended family. That is normal. I grew up in an extended family. I grew up with grandparents in the house and being able to go to my crazy cousins and aunts and uncles' houses and all that. And that was hugely formational and beneficial for me as a human being. The nuclear family, which is isolated to just the two people, as parents and the children. It's not normal historically, and I don't think it's healthy. Children are to be provided with the fullest and deepest possible experience of secure family life and activity. The family is not to be idolized as an end in itself, because then it becomes an obstacle to your life spiritually. Okay, next time we'll talk about the sacrament itself, and then go from there, I think, into, I guess, priesthood or whatever's next. But we'll stop today because another long class. So I will stop the video, and then anybody who has any questions, we can have our conversation. God bless.